Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any further delay, let me introduce our guest. I am so excited to be interviewing Dr. Amy H. Sturgis today. Amy is a monthly contributor on the podcast StarShipSofa and is editor-in-chief of Hocus Pocus Comics. Her Tolkien-related scholarship is a very long list, so much so that we don't get to touch on all of it in today's episode. But we will put links to several edited collections that include her work and links to articles from journals on our show notes, so please make sure to check those out. On a personal note, I'm excited to interview Dr. Sturgis today because she played a large role in influencing me to get involved in Tolkien scholarship. So without further ado, let's get right to the questions. So Amy, I wanted to dive right in with the first question of the podcast. How were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
I was first given The Hobbit by my grandfather. I was in elementary school. We lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Rankin Bass film version of The Hobbit was going to come on television. And so my grandfather wanted me to have the source material first before seeing the adaptation. And so he gave me The Hobbit, and that was my very first open door into Tolkien's world.
And I know that you, in your day job, really like to blend both your fan experience of fantasy and Tolkien, and actually speculative fiction more generally, with your kind of academic pursuits. Do you think that being exposed to work like this at such a young age kind of helped you blend those two sides of it together?
Oh, definitely. I think, well, I know that I was already a science fiction fan before I started kindergarten because of watching the reruns of Star Trek and then seeing Star Wars in the theater. And then after that, I came to books and films and such. I think it was really important because I encountered these works before I knew what was considered to be, legitimate subjects of study by the Academy, and I didn't have a snobbish bone in my body, and my entire family just fed whatever I was interested in. And so if it moved me, if I was enthusiastic about it, it was important. And that's sort of been a guiding principle for the rest of my life. I don't see the point of pigeonholing the things you love, and pigeonholing your life. And the other blessing was that my mother was a historian, a history teacher, and very passionate about her own work and fed me history as well. And I ate that up with a great appetite. And so I was also led to seek out these speculative works, these imaginative works that had a sense of deep history and deep time. And all these things connected before I understood there were disciplines or that there were genres. I saw all of it as one big thing, and it was awesome. And so that kind of was already there. And the participatory aspect too, whether people were dressing up or singing songs about what they liked, or the idea of consuming things through different media, whether you're reading something or watching a film or what have you. I think it was really important to have all of those divisions blurred for me at an early age, so that when others tried to impose those lines later, it just didn't take.
So I think I know what you mean by the phrase deep history or deep time, but could you just go ahead and clarify in case some of our listeners would like to know more about that? What do you mean when you say deep history or deep time?
Yes, just the sense that real history is bleeding through on every page or in every frame. The idea that works are inspired by the way cultures work, the way languages work. The first that come to mind are Tolkien and Frank Herbert with the original Dune series, for that matter, Lois McMaster Bujold's work, but works that show that the authors understand sort of the rise and fall of empires, the way that language can move and evolve and adapt, and really just a sense of also human nature, that the world building is well grounded, and there's a research involved in how the mechanics of these sub creations actually function. I guess Tolkien would call that just well employed fantasy, because it's detailed enough and consistent enough that it sort of seduces the audience into belief, because you know how the world works, so then you can create a sub-created world that also in its own right works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. I'm kind of curious about, what is your favorite part of Tolkien's work? What kind of draws you back again and again?
I think if you'd asked that at different times, you'd have gotten very different answers from me. But right now, I recognize a pattern, and this connects to my own study and my own understanding of history and other things. But Tolkien describes humanity and the human experience as soaked in a sense of exile. And I know part of that is tied to his own understanding of Catholicism, and I'm not Catholic, so that's not the way that works for me. But I think that sense of separation, of distance between what should be and what is, speaks to me the most in Tolkien's work. And the older I get, the more it speaks to me. That sense of exile is this evergreen concept that really resonates. And you can see that play through his works in so many ways. And I think that through line in his vision is relevant in a lot of different directions.
It actually reminds me of a recent show I was watching where two comedians were talking about what they like to play with is the exact same material that a lot of people see in tragedy. It's the intention never quite lines up with the reality or what we're actually capable of doing.
Right.
And so the reason why we split things into tragedy and comedy is you can either play that as, oh, isn't this terrible? Isn't this the condition of all of us? Or you can play it as a comedy of, look at this one person that wouldn't you never have tried to do this thing? And so you can kind of alienate that person's experience or kind of accept that person's experience. And that kind of defines it as either tragedy or comedy.
Oh, I like that. That's a good insight.
So with that being said, is that, do you think that this sense of exile ties in with the sense of kind of the deep history to make it a more universal story?
Definitely, I do, because that speaks to human experience, globally and across time, and it allows for, I think, a heroism in the face of defeat, that notion of fighting the long defeat, that notion that you can win, and yet your culture, your people, your experience may be in decline, and you have to accept that your age is over, even if you're the one who won. And that appreciation that, on the one hand, you are very small and the world is very big, and on the other hand, you're part of an experience that's bigger than you are. I think you're quite right.
So in your different readings of Tolkien or experiences of his work, which one stands out to you as your fondest experience?
I think it's tied to what people have done with his work. I'm very an enthusiastic consumer of, for example, music that is made from his work. And all of what reading his work leads people to do. Be if he's a sub creator, then they become sub creators. But I was thinking about the experiences that have moved me most. And for example, in 2002, I was lucky enough to be one of the co-founders of the Loma Lindy Nashville chapter of the Tolkien Society. And that brought me friends that are, dear friends to this day. And that was because we all had this loved thing held in common, and it spoke to us, and that's Tolkien's work. I was one of the coordinators of, or directors of, the Past Watchful Dragons conference in 2005, which was based on C.S. Lewis's work, but there was so much Tolkien content. And at the end, and my mother flew out to attend that, and we sat there and watched at the end the Nashville Symphony play the music from the Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson version. And that communal experience of all of us sitting there and hearing that performance, when we all knew where it came from and we all knew what inspired it, was very moving to me. I've been so fortunate to get to go to events and meet people and see at the gathering of the fellowship in Toronto over 2 different years that they met. There was the debut of the Return of the King film, and then there was the debut of Lord of the Rings the musical on the Toronto stage, and both of those were amazing. But I think the thing that sticks with me most, there's an international event called A Long Expected Party that is held every few years at the Shaker Village, historic Shaker Village in Kentucky, and you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of this remarkable historical setting. And people come together from all over the United States and from other countries and essentially create the Shire there. And at the end of several days of academic presentations and fan presentations and performances, there's a recreation of Bilbo's birthday party under the party tree, outdoors, and people come in costume, and there are hobbits there, and there are other folk there from Middle-earth, and there's music, and there are toasts and such, and Bilbo's there, and the experience of walking into this clearing, and it's a recreation of Middle-earth, and all these disparate people from very different lives and very different experiences have found something that they want to celebrate, and they bring texts to read, and they bring musical interpretations of songs from the work, and it's such a clear proof that these are living documents, right? That the literature is alive and evolving and creating creators, if you will. And it was just such a moving experience to sort of look out across this gathering of people as if we were, in a sense, living in a book. And it was just beautiful. So I think the things that move me most are the ways that people come together and celebrate something that's meant very much to them and has been very important to them and has changed their lives.
It sounds like a really special event.
Definitely is.
So I'm just thinking that there seems to me your appreciation for an interest in kind of reception, almost the way that people take in a work and respond to it, seems in many ways to go along with your particular focus academically with intellectual history. It's kind of because, right, you're there seeing people kind of take in and respond to new ideas, and your larger focus is on kind of the evolution of ideas over time. So do you see those two things as interacting often? Do you feel like you're kind of there as inspiration is taking shape sometimes?
Yes, very much so. That was very well put. It would take me a long time to verbalize that. Yes, I think you're quite right. And one of the things that fascinates me about ideas is how they transfer from individual to individual, and how they move through communities and find new places of purchase and new relevance. And actually, most of my Tolkien scholarship, my essays and things that have been published, have been about fan reaction, fan fiction, for example, how people take Tolkien and then write about Tolkien's work. And I see that sort of participatory culture thing, that transformative work impulse that people have. It's so important because some ideas people are, or for that matter, just depictions, are pleasing to people. They want to watch a movie or they want to read a book and feel good and move on. But there's something important and noteworthy about those works that invite participation, and people can't move on until they've actually spoken back to it in some way. And so I think the multi-generational now phenomenon of fan fiction writers and fan artists and fan musicians who all want to contribute in some way with art or with writing or with song, and are finding relevance in the ideas and also want to speak to the moment. I did an entire scholarly article that was about how women were writing and reimagining Rosie, who become Rose Gamgee after she married Sam. This character, what she means to these fans at a moment after waves of feminism and after all kinds of different discourse about who are fans in the community and who are creators, and writing a woman's experience. And it's just interesting to see how, you could say, well, just move on to a work that's centered with a woman lead. But there's something there that makes these creators, these sub-creators or sub-creators say, this is where I want to explore this idea in the larger context of Tolkien's vision. And I really do think there's something terribly important and beautiful about works that, again, inspire people to join the conversation.
I remember that essay. That was a really good essay.
Thank you very much.
Was that in the Tolkien on Film collection?
Actually, that's a different one. That was about fan fiction writers who were trying to make Peter Jackson's films speak to Tolkien's texts and sort of bridge the gaps that were there. This one was in Mythlore, actually.
Oh, okay.
Back in, 2006. That's been a while. But yes, I just find that fascinating.
Since it's on Mythlore, that means it would be freely available online. So shout out there. We'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you. And I believe the other one is as well, because that book was by the Mythmoot Press. So I believe that the one from Tolkien on Film is online as well.
Great. So with as much as you're interacting with the fandom, and as long as you've been experiencing, both Tolkien's work and adaptations, I'm sure that you've been interacting with a lot of different fan groups over time. So I'm very curious to hear how you feel like your approach to Tolkien's work has changed over time.
That's a very good question. Part of it, I think, has to do in a technical aspect with the tools that are now available as a critical mass of people are online and then are active and creators and consumers of digital media. So particularly podcasting, for example. Some of my work now that I would have tried to publish as essays end up on podcasts instead, or first drafts end up on podcasts. But there's also movement in sort of the scholarly discourse that I really welcome, particularly because my other field is Indigenous American Studies, and I'm very interested in Indigenous futurism and some of the other fiction and creativity that is coming out of a unique moment in Native America. And so the kinds of questions about decolonizing Tolkien or universalizing Tolkien, looking at perhaps non-Western, and by Western there I'm meaning Western European perspectives of story and how they may fit with or contrast with other kinds of story. My interests sort of shift as my work shifts, and yet there's so much there in Tolkien that I keep finding relevant places to go. But I think part of it has to do with tools, and part of it has to do with evolving conversations that I find are, in fact, very relevant to Tolkien and to Tolkien's studies and to the studies of works that I find adjacent to Tolkien. I've found, for example, there are aspects of H.P. Lovecraft's work that from an intellectual history standpoint seem to be of the same moment as Tolkien, and I've written a bit about that. But some of the same conversations about race or about how we contextualize works are relevant there as well. So again, wherever the conversation goes, Tolkien seems to be a sort of endless, bottomless well of subject that allows you to go back and drink from that well over and over again.
It reminds me of Verlin Flieger has, in a couple different places, made the argument that there's just so much in Tolkien that people who try to really nail him down and say he's this or that are always going to be very frustrated because somewhere else he says the exact opposite.
That is very true. And also, he wrote over such a long span of time. He was writing before World War II. He was writing after World War II. The experiences that he had and the experiences that the world went through, changed things. But I will say that I'm very pleased that his scholarship and such continues to get the attention it does, because after all of the things that I've read, I still think On Fairy Stories is probably my favorite work by Tolkien. And the fact that we can have these snapshots of his thought at a moment and yet appreciate that his is a three-dimensional and very, very large universe, intellectually speaking. I completely agree with Verlin about that. There's a lot there in Tolkien.
So you mentioned On Fairy Stories, and you've also mentioned H.P. Lovecraft, and I know that you're familiar with Edgar Allan Poe. So just as we were sitting here, I was thinking that in my very first interview, Demetria Feeney said that she often recommends that people studying fantasy read On Fairy Stories because she uses that to demonstrate to them how the authors writing genre fiction were the first people who really kind of considered critically genre fiction and like what its purpose was and what it actually does and what it's attempting to do for readers, those kinds of things. So I'm getting back to your H.P. Lovecraft thing. I know from a course that I took with you on Gothic fantasy and things like that the same is true in other subcategories of speculative fiction. So like we have Lovecraft and Poe really both were very influential outside of their fiction.
Right.
In terms of creating editorials or commentaries and those kinds of things. And so as the person I know who studies this kind of thing, do you see Tolkien's role as a commentator as similar to that of Poe or Lovecraft, or different?
Oh, that's a great question. I definitely think, for example, if you take Lovecraft's work, supernatural horror in literature, which is this bibliographic work, but it also not only says we have a tradition here and people in different places over different times are doing the same thing. Now, what is it they're doing? Well, let's break this down, right? He's giving legitimacy to this genre, and he's saying, what do we have here? And also, to a degree, doing the same kind of thing as Tolkien on fairy stories, saying it's really important we understand that there is a longer history here. That longer history says these works are not for children. It's a very recent accident in history even, that we tend to think this work belongs in the nursery, because it doesn't, and this longer history tells us that. But also, it's important to know what's in the stew, but it's important to ask, why does the stew taste good, right? And they were both involved in the same kind of thing there. And then if you look at Poe earlier, he did give legitimacy, particularly by taking other works seriously and reviewing them in the same way that, great works of literature with a capital L were being reviewed. But he also said, what lessons can we learn here? And so he would write things such as, what should the short story accomplish? And how can it accomplish that? And he gave blueprints for, if you want to be a part of this conversation, what are some of the lessons we can draw from what's already been there? And I think Tolkien did the same thing too. He did it when he was looking at other texts, when he was looking at Beowulf, when he was looking at Sir Gawain, the Green Knight, when he was looking at just what a fairy story is and isn't, and putting some of those works outside the bounds of his definition, like Alice in Wonderland, for example. So I think I'm sort of talking myself into my answer as I go here, but were involved in the same sorts of analysis in a way, giving both a history to the genre they were involved with, but also a legitimacy to looking at it with a critical eye, and then learning lessons from those analyses that would better the people who came after them and would give a kind of roadmap for those who wanted to join those specific conversations. And I think the idea of conversation is just so important, because these were writers who read other writers, and they were not only creating new conversations, but they were taking part in conversations that already existed, and they were very aware of that fact. And so they were being sort of genre historians at the same time that they were being teachers of those who wanted to join in. And by being both, they were saying this work deserves grown-up, adult, even scholarly attention. And so we owe them a huge debt of gratitude.
Well, I have to say that was a phenomenal answer for a question you had no foreknowledge of.
Well, thank you. At 2:00 tomorrow morning, I'll have a really, really good answer. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'll follow it with a much easier question. Would you ever recommend Tolkien's work, and why or why not?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. And I think I do, in the sense that I teach classes on Tolkien, and I also go to speak about Tolkien in different places, because it's, again, there are ideas there that are so relevant today. The idea of, characters striving against all odds, fighting even when they know they're facing these terrible odds, maybe even a long defeat, disparate individuals working together against a common enemy, while still retaining their own identities and their own paths. And Tolkien, again, has made other creators. So, for example, one of the more recent projects that I've been involved with was looking at how post Disney taking charge of Lucasfilm, the new Star Wars storytelling, particularly in, but not limited to, the television series, but also in the new films, has a very clear and intentional influence of Tolkien just bleeding through. The creators who are, for example, Dave Filoni and others who are involved in Star Wars storytelling now, have made very intentional references to Tolkien, and even said, if you want to understand what we're doing with Star Wars right now, you not only need to read Lord of the Rings, but you need to read Tolkien's letters, and here are some of the letters we'd suggest you read. I mean, they're serious about that, but that's also then the springboard for new creativity and new stories. And so if you want to understand so much of what's happening today, the starting point, and we're told that by creators today, the starting point is Tolkien. But I also think the reason we're having a new adaptation being made right now is that he's not just relevant because of the works he's inspired. His work is relevant, period. And, I think it's a very exciting prospect to bring new readers and new viewers and new listeners in all sorts of ways to Tolkien's work, because there's a lot there that speaks directly to what the world's going through today.
Wow, that's excellent. I had no idea that the writers on Star Wars were hearkening back to Tolkien.
There's really exciting stuff there. Even, for example, Dave Filoni, who is the showrunner of both Star Wars, the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, and is now involved with Mandalorian, has drawn images of his original characters like Ahsoka Tano or Kanan Jarrus from Star Wars, having conversations with Gandalf or Bilbo. I mean, he'll put a picture on his social media of his characters and then a Tolkien quote underneath it that says exactly what might be coming out of the mouths of his own characters, and some really intentional homages. But it's not just a quote here or there. There's a really profound sense that the people who are working on these stories get some of the deeper meanings and deeper messages that Tolkien was trying to convey, and that bleeds through in Star Wars in a really interesting way. So it's a good time to be a Star Wars fan as well as a Tolkien fan.
So the last question I like to ask on the podcast is, what are you working on now that our fans could read or listen to or watch or support in some way?
I have something coming out every month on Starship Sofa, which is a science fiction podcast, and I do a looking back in genre history segment that is involved with some aspect of science fiction, fantasy, or horror every month. So I would invite people to come by and listen there. Right now, I'm working on 2 writing projects. I'm writing the introduction to a volume called A Finality of Ghosts, Supernatural Stories by Women, 1901 to 1920. And that is edited by Johnny Maines, and that should be hopefully maybe coming out by the end of the year, maybe early 2021. But that's going to be a really exciting volume because a lot of these Gothic stories have been all but lost. And so it's really recovering works that have not had the readership they deserve. And then I'm also working on a bit of scholarship on Lois McMaster Bujould's novella Flowers of Vashnoy from 2018. There's going to be a little mini volume of scholarship in ebook form to support the publication of the essay collection, Biology and Manners, the essays on the worlds and works of Lois McMaster Bujold, which was edited by Una McCormick and Regina Young Lee. And so they're going to do sort of a follow-up volume in support of that with works on some of Bujold's most recent publications. And so I'm working right now on a bit of analysis on Flowers of Vashnoy. Don't have a title yet, just doing some research at this point, but I'm very excited about that. And I'm hoping to talk about how that novella is in conversation with a work from 29 years earlier, or The Mountains of Mourning, which is an award-winning novella by Bujold that's just brilliant. And I think those two works are actually very intentionally talking to each other. So doing a bit of academic writing there. So trying to keep busy during this pandemic lockdown time. So
Excellent. Well, I'll look forward to your two written works, and it's great with the ebook. We get to double dip because Una McCormick was an earlier guest of ours.
fantastic.
So supporting lots of scholars is great. But thank you so much for being able to sit down and talk with me. I've really enjoyed hearing about your Tolkien experience.
Oh, thank you so much. This has just been an absolute delight, and I appreciate your invitation and this experience. Thank you so much.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favorite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience, and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronL.Palmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.